Good morning, children. Hope you are all doing well and completing your assignments on time. In today's lesson, we will discuss about the second economic reform under LPG, which is liberalization. Liberalization is made from the word liberty, and liberty means freedom. Children, remember in previous chapter to Indian Economic 1950 to 1990, we studied about licensing, quotas, and permits policies adopted by our government which aim at regulating the economic activities. But now these policies became major hindrances in growth and development. So, liberalization was introduced to put an end to these restrictions and open various sectors of economy. So, liberalization of the economy means its freedom from direct or physical controls imposed by the government. Thus, when government liberalizes trade, it means it has removed the tariff, subsidies, and other restrictions on the flow of goods and services between countries. Reforms were made in the major sectors of the economy, namely industrial sector reforms, financial sector reforms, fiscal reforms, foreign exchange reforms, trade and investment policy reforms. So first, we will start with industrial sector reforms. The first industrial sector reform is abolition of industrial licensing. Prior to 1991, every entrepreneur had to obtain permission from government to start a firm, close a firm, or decide the amount of goods that could be produced. In obtaining such permission, a lot of time was being wasted, which could otherwise be used for expanding their business. Therefore, according to New Economic Policy 1991, industrial licensing was abolished for almost all industries except 6 industries. At present, there are only 6 industries which need compulsory licensing. These are alcohol, cigarettes, defense equipments, industrial explosives, hazardous chemicals, drugs and pharmaceuticals. Second, contraction of public sector. Now public sector was opened to private sector. In IPR 1956, if you remember, we studied about government enterprises were producing almost everything from bread, telecommunications to electronics and mobile automobiles. It was realized that there was no need for the government to produce everything, and government should get out of areas which private sector can manage. Therefore, only 3 industries are now reserved for public sector, namely defense equipments, atomic energy generation, and railway transport. The third economic reform is that government gave freedom to import capital goods. As you know that capital goods are those goods which help in the further production of consumer goods, For example, machinery, tools and equipments. Prior to 1991, there were restrictions on import of capital goods and technology, but now they have been removed in order to build better infrastructure base in country. The fourth industrial sector reform is de-reservation of production areas. Prior to 1991, some goods could be produced only by small scale industries. But now, these production areas were de-reserved. That means now even large scale industries can produce these goods. And the last point is that market was allowed to determine prices. Prior to 1991, the price was fixed in industry as per directions of government. But now, in many industries, the market has been allowed to determine the prices. Financial reforms. Financial sector includes financial institutions such as commercial banks, investment banks, stock exchange, and foreign exchange market. RBI, Reserve Bank of India, is the apex bank which supervises and regulates financial sector and make monetary policy for our country. The first reform in financial sector is that the role of RBI was changed from regulator to facilitator of the financial sector. This means that before 1991, the role of RBI was more of a regulator or controller. It used to fix interest rates and kept high reserve requirements under cash reserve ratio and statutory liquidity ratio. With the introduction of new economic policy of 1991, the role of RBI has been changed from regulator to facilitator of financial sector. It means that now financial sector is allowed to take decisions on many matters without consulting RBI. The second financial sector reform is increasing role of the private sector. After reforms, private sector and foreign sector banks were established in the financial sector. Foreign investment limit in banks was now raised to around 50%. The third financial reform is entry of foreign institutional investors. Now, what do you mean by foreign institutional investor? A foreign institutional investor is an investor in a financial market outside its official home country. With new economic policy of 1991, merchant bankers, mutual funds, and pension funds are now allowed to invest in Indian financial market. Next reforms are fiscal reforms. Fiscal reforms refer to the reforms in the taxation and expenditure policy of the government. Let's talk of some of the tax reforms of 1991. The first fiscal reform is reduction in direct tax rates. As you know, that direct taxes are those taxes which are imposed on income of individuals as well as on profits of business enterprises. Example, income tax, corporate tax. In case of direct tax, the liability to pay tax and the burden of tax falls on the same person. It was realized that high tax rates encourages evasion of tax by people. As against this, moderate tax rates encourage savings and investment. Therefore, as part of tax reforms, various tax rates, especially income tax and corporate tax, were lowered. The second reform is simplification of tax structure. Prior to 1991, the structure of tax was very complicated. But with the new economic policy of 1991, efforts have been made to simplify the tax structure. The third reform is reforms in indirect taxes. Indirect taxes are those taxes which are imposed on commodities. In case of indirect tax, liability to pay tax and burden of tax falls on different people. Reforms were initiated in indirect taxes with the aim of establishing an integrated national market. Recently, goods and services tax was introduced in 2017. This is expected to generate additional revenue for government, reduce tax evasion, and create one nation, one tax, and one market. Next reforms are foreign exchange reforms. In this, the first reform is devaluation of rupee. In 1991, India suffered from severe balance of payment crisis, which means that the outflow of foreign exchange was more than the inflow of foreign exchange. So, to solve this problem, rupee was devalued by the government. Devaluation implies a fall in the value of rupee against some foreign currency. In 1991, rupee was devalued to increase countries' exports and to discourage imports. This solved the problem of balance of payment crisis. The second reform under foreign exchange reforms is market determined exchange rate. Earlier, determination of foreign exchange rate was controlled by government. But after devaluation in 1991, determination of exchange rate was left to the forces of market, that is demand and supply. And the last set of reforms are trade and investment policy reforms. These were initiated to increase international competitiveness of industrial production and also foreign investment and technology into economy. Under these reforms, the first one is import quotas, that is, quantitative restrictions on imports were abolished. The second reform is that import licensing was abolished except in case of hazardous and environmental sensitive industries. Third, import duties have been lowered in the reform period. And the fourth and the last reform is that export duties have been removed to increase the competitive position of Indian exports. So this is about the trade and investment policy reforms. So let us revise quickly that what we have done today. As you can see in this mind map, that there are 5 important reforms under liberalization. The first one is industrial sector reform, in which there was deregulation of industrial sector, augmentation of production capacity, freedom in importing capital goods, and reforms in small-scale industries. The second reform is financial sector reform, in which we studied about shift in role of RBI, increase in role of private sector, and entry of FIIs in the financial market. The third reform is fiscal reform, in which we discussed about reduction in direct tax rates, simplification of tax structure, and reforms in indirect tax. The fourth reform is trade and investment reform, in which we discussed removal of quantitative restrictions on trade, reducing tariff rate, encouraging foreign direct investment, and opening up of special economic zones. And the last is foreign exchange reforms, in which we studied about devaluation of rupee and flexible exchange rate system, which is the market exchange rate system. So children, that's it for today's lesson. You have to attempt all the questions which have been given to you in the assignment in the previous lesson. Thank you.